So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my work, and I'm going to give you a little bit of history prior to that, so you can hopefully understand a little bit where this comes from. I come from Western Kansas originally, but have lived in Kansas City for about 28 years. My background from, birth on up, I've had a fiber and fabric background. Grandmother who was a professional seamstress, another grandmother who made rugs, and a mother who was, while not a professional seamstress, certainly could have been. And I did that myself when I was very young and had little babies at home. I worked in retail and throughout the night sewing, okay? So at some point in my art life, as my children were growing older, the use of the fabrics and sewing became rather unsatisfying for me, let me say. And I, one morning, just rather unceremoniously picked up my sewing machine and walked to the trash can and disposed of it. I think back about that now and think I really could have given that away to somebody, But at any rate, what it did for me was it helped me move forward with my work. I was on my own. I had nothing else to fall back on, and so I went back to school at that time. I then went back to school again in the 90s and got a master's degree from the University of Kansas. My academic background is in sculpture, but by the time I was teaching at the Kansas City Art Institute, my work was already evolving into different shape and form. I moved from metals, where I was at the Art Institute, began teaching metal casting and ceramic shell mold making. But my own work was moving into plastics and rubbers, and from there into the photography. I very much have a history of loving to walk and to hike, and it was the hikes in the mountains of Colorado where the photography really started to develop. I began shooting images of myself, which was basically my own shadow. I became bored with that fairly quickly. But what I did find in those images outside of myself was what I was seeing through the shadows and in other parts of the image. And that became important to me. One thing led to the other, and on my walks and on my hikes, I continued to take my camera and I started shooting images of people I was following. And that has become an important part of my process. And in fact, this piece comes directly from that kind of a process. I followed this person on a hike near the Grand Canyon. Took probably about 150 photographs or more, which I'm still interested in, by the way. But I selected 4 images to work with. And so what it relates to is my strong interest in pedestrian activity, the kind of things that happen around us every day, for the better, for the worse, but that kind of pass through our lives. We see it, we recognize it, and then it's gone. And I've always had a strong interest in the things that seem less significant to people. I suppose if I were taking a multiple choice test on insignificant facts, I would probably do quite well, but if it were the opposite, I may not do quite as well. But what I have found in developing that interest is the fact that I have found a new way to look and to see and to find out more about us. While I am moving and I'm taking these photographs, movement tends to influence the way that my mind processes ideas. And so I try to take those ideas and then manifest them into this work. Basically, I work from a foundation where I collect the information and accumulate volumes of the information. I then deconstruct that information, and then I reorganize it and put it all back together. I just put it back together in a much different way. Collecting the information is generally precipitated by taking the photographs. Sometimes it is actually collecting real materials that I use, and in those cases I photograph those materials as well. I then deconstruct it, and in this case it is severely reducing the size of the photograph. And that is something that I frequently do. I reduce the size of the photograph. I use a lot of repetition. In most of my work, and this is where we can relate back to the sewing and the fiber and fabric background, patterns start to appear in my work. I don't ever plan the pattern, but as I start to work, I begin to recognize that through the repetition and through a selection process of which images to use, a pattern will start forming. Sometimes I go ahead and I really orchestrate that pattern. It might be diagonal, it might be organic, and other times, as in the case of this particular piece, where I started working in the center of the piece and worked out in all directions. I began with 4 photographs. I thought, because of those 4 photographs laid together, that there might be the potential to develop a plaid, but I didn't know for sure. And sure enough, I started to see some semblance of a plaid in it. But what I didn't plan on, as I worked on it more and more, and the more I got further and further back from it, these wandering stripes began to appear. And so I just simply followed the direction that the work took me in. I didn't try to plan any of it. Some of these photos are compressed together, and that makes for the narrowing of the stripe. Some are pushed much further, spread much further apart, which makes for the wider part, of course. And so I continued to work on this. The shape and form of this piece, this actually evolved. This piece I worked on, I began in late 2010, and I finished it in 2012. The piece was actually put together shortly before 2012, but the shape of the piece had not yet taken form. And so I worked with a number of different backings. Given that I had spent a considerable time out in the out-of-doors near the Grand Canyon, in hilly areas, spending a great deal of time photographing these images, I could not escape the fact that there had to be contour in this piece. And so I worked on it actually horizontally on a table for a considerable amount of time. I experimented with different types of backing and found the correct solution to that, or at least to my mind, the correct solution. And created this undulating form. It's still a very flexible piece. It doesn't lay flat, but it's still flexible, much like a tapestry would be. And so I don't know if you can easily peek underneath this, and there is a wool felt backing adhering to the back and helping it to hold its shape. And so most of my work, outside of this involves the assembly of photographs. And I am out on the street often, or people are passing me by, and I shoot photographs. I collect them. They go into files. I continue to evaluate the photographs over and over. I continue to add to them. My files are determined, the photographs are file determined by place, what I'm doing, where I might be going. All of those things are influential in how I pull my imagery together. Does anybody have any? Sure. I do not. I work from a distance for the most part. I've never run into a problem with it. I've only a few times people have asked me not to take their photograph, and I respect that, and I don't. But for the most part, most people, when I work from a distance, it's usually a profile. If I am taking a photograph straight on, somebody knows it, yeah. And so I haven't really had too many problems with that. I will say the one thing that I have not confronted without permission, of course, are children. And so most of my work involves adults. But that's also in great part just by the nature of where I am or what I'm doing. And so, yeah, sure.
I found it interesting you talked about how you file photographs.
Yes.
One of the things that strikes me so much about this, I think you're saying, is the color and the way color comes together. So I was really surprised to hear you not mention that you file these by color.
I do not. They're actually filed by photograph number and the dates. And so I know exactly when I took them, and in what sequence I took them. Sequence is often important. I mean, not always, but often it is. But it's when I start pulling those photographs out, and then color can play a large part. It doesn't always, but it can. And I'm glad you brought that up because I think one of the things, I'm sure you've all probably had some level of art history, if not a great deal of it. And certainly in this museum and many others, you pick up a lot. But one of the things that I have become much more aware of during the last decade and a half working on these kind of pieces was Impressionist painting. And that had a lot to do with the way they talked about laying colors side by side and how those colors together can produce another color depending on your vantage point. And I count on that a great deal when color is important to me. One of the things that's very important in my work is when you approach this from a distance, from somewhere out of close range of this piece or any of my works, it's going to look like something completely different than it actually is. It has a number of personalities, okay? So your first impression is that it may be a pattern, it may be a painting, it may not, you probably won't even recognize that it's photographs, but you may pick up on pattern and direction in it and abstraction. It's really, I'm overlaying a rather conceptual abstraction over the reality of these photographs. And as you change your vantage point and come closer, you see that. So in the same way, the Impressionist paintings work very similarly in that way, and that color changes when you're further apart and vibrates and becomes something different than when you are very close and inspecting it. And so I became aware of that as I have been working on those pieces that, I guess what goes around comes around. What you study and what you grew up with comes back to you in some unexpected ways, yes. And I must say, when I first started noticing, maybe about 10 years ago in my work, I started seeing the patterns and I started seeing the reference to the fabrics and fibers. I was not terribly thrilled. I have to say. Now, I thought I left this behind me. I'm looking for something else. But in truth, you have to let yourself go to find out what you really are looking for. And so at some point, I threw my hands up and I said, it is It is what it is, and I welcome it, and I accept it for what it is, and I'm going to investigate it and work with it until I can't walk or till my hands don't work. And so, yes.
How do you put your photos together? I mean, is it glue or, I mean, how do you put them together?
Sure, I'd be glad to answer that. The way that I put the photos together is first, having taken it, I make a selection of the photos and organize those on my computer. They go onto a massive grid. I determine the size, of course, size it way down if that's what I'm doing, or section it apart if that's what I'm doing. I put them in massive grids, and then they go to, I have an archival printer in Kansas City who is amazing. We work to be sure that the color is the same as my camera, and then he prints sheets out for me, and then they go back to my studio, and then I usually have a helper or two who help me cut them apart, because there's usually thousands of them to cut apart. If it's a real small piece, it might only be hundreds, so, and those go quickly. But they're cut apart in strips, and then we go through and snip them all apart. And then those photographs generally are glued onto a substrate. Frequently, my substrate is some form of wool felt in varying degrees. Sometimes it is very, very thin, and sometimes, in this case, it's pretty thick. I think this is about 3/8 inches of a pretty dense felt. Yeah, I think it's like an F1 or something. I don't remember, but occasionally I will use Japanese paper that has a lot of fiber in it. It stays flexible. It stays very thin if I need a piece to remain flexible. Occasionally I will use a really thin grade of wool felt, and I'll wrap it with silk, and that makes a really beautiful backing. Not that you do see the backings, but I actually believe that the surface of my work, the part that you see, is always better for the best kind of backing that is on it. I would not feel bad turning them backwards for you to inspect. I think that's part of the process, and it's part of the caring, and it's part of just the determination to complete the work in a way that is best suitable for everybody. Yeah. Do we have any other questions?
So your residency at the studio just ended, and you shared that that was sort of a big revelation for you in terms of having the space and be able to move in this direction of your work. Do you feel some new momentum occurring, or are you going to continue with this series or anything else?
Well, the first thing I'll say, certainly I'm continuing with these. I did a small series of these quite a while ago, and this was the last in the series that I've done, but I am continuing with it. All of my bodies of works, of which I rotate between while I'm working, I almost never work on just one body of work. All of them are long-term projects, and so far, probably, I mean, like, as the photographs, and these actually began before the residency, so this is a progression into that. But the photos go back beyond 10 years. Since I've had my residency, I began working on a series of works, installation works, and works made from photographing the installation material as well as producing work out of this actual material, and that is shredded junk mail that comes from my father's mailbox. And I would invite all of you to go to my website and check it out. I just had a solo show featuring that work in Kansas City that was taken down the day before I arrived here. But what it entailed was, I'll give you just a brief history on that so you can understand. And this is where my 3,000 square feet of workspace came in. really, it was critically important to that work, but it also informed what I can do with the photographic work and what I have been doing with newer work that engages the photos. But so I had all this momentous space to spread out in. When I started collecting that junk mail, there's a long history behind it, but let's just say this. My father died from Alzheimer's a year ago, but while he was still able to read and to write a little bit, certain things were much more important to him than other things. Certain things he became focused on, and other things disappeared. And it was the junk mail. He loved his mail, and he really, that's what he wanted to engage with, and so that's what he had. The problem became when he would fill out forms and my mother would mail them. And so if you can only imagine exponentially, the incoming mail grew. So it was my job at that time managing his health care. I carried off as much as my mother would allow me to take, which was probably 25 to 30% of the mail. I think she was very concerned about what I was going to do with that mail. I assured her I was shredding it and that her name would never appear anywhere in public. But for a couple of years, this is going on 3 years now that I've been working on this project. For a couple of years, I think there was, not a lot of trust. So now, as of this summer, she's giving all of it to me. But nevertheless, what I found out when I shredded that paper and I poured that out onto the floor of my studio, and I had about 100 feet of piles of shredded paper. It's pretty amazing how it can accumulate from one human being very quickly. I found out that it was readable in a very nonlinear way, that words and phrases and symbols and beautiful little tiny cuts from the shreds that came from ads or security envelopes would rise to the top. And so I started plucking some of those out, and I've been documenting them in these little moleskin books, and I'm not sure what I'm going to do with those yet, but it's there and something will happen with it. Others I was photographing. I photographed the individual pieces I pulled out, and I also photographed areas where I spotted those through the camera lens. And I must say that camera lens is truly collaborative with me, particularly with this paperwork, with this work, and with my commute route photographs. I couldn't do it without something that is finding something else a little unique that the naked eye is not necessarily going to find. And so well, actually, there's a curvature to the lens, and it sees in a different way that the eye sees. And I think that and I may not be totally correct on this, but I have been told and I've read that we actually see a lot of what that lens picks up, but we can only see it for you can't even count how long, a microsecond. But that lens will find it, and so there will be color and shape that show up. But in these shredded paper files, it will find things that I simply can't spot with my eye. And so I'm able to use that kind of information. So anyway, I have been doing actual floor installations with the shredded paper. The piece, or the solo show I just took down, was the third in a sequence of those. The first one was called Read This at Hall Contemporary Gallery in Kansas City. The second was part of a group show at the Bemis Center for Contemporary Art in Omaha, Nebraska. And then the third extension of that was at Studio Zinc in Kansas City, the show I just took down. Related to that was a wall installation that I did, 4 feet by 24 feet long, where I attached single layers of individual pieces of shredded paper to 4 by 4 foot panels, and then we attached 6 of them together to create the wall installation. And it was like it's like a massive scroll. And so it was constructed in reverse, vertical columns from left to right, so that it overlaps right to left as you read. And while it doesn't have, the readability is the discovery and the finding of the text and the phrasing that you find inside of the work. And so, and then there was another piece that was strictly combined from the photography, just as I would use this and as I described to you. It's all on my website if you are interested, and of course, if any of you come to Kansas City, you are welcome to visit my studio until December 31, or maybe a few days before that. And after that, I'm still looking. I think I've got something nailed down, but I'll know this week. So you're always welcome. My contact information stays the same, and I would welcome any of you.
What is your website?
It's mikibaird.com, MIKIBAIRD.
I have a quick question. We always have to find the secret story as we patch together the state-of-the-art exhibition. What was your experience with the curator, and who was it, and what came about during your studio visit?
Great, I'm glad you asked. It was a terrific experience. I received an email the day before my visit from Don Bacigalupi's office, and I looked at the email and I thought, I wonder if this is real. So I called. And I just explained that I wanted to be sure that, you know, what I was reading was legitimate. And she was very kind, and it certainly was. And they set up an appointment for me for the next day. And that was Dawn, and then Chad Allagood visited my studio. We spent quite a bit of time talking. It was all audio and videotaped, which I did not know, and which I think was a good thing not to know. I know when I saw that audio recorder and he asked for permission, and I just thought, sure. But it was very intimidating. But I forgot about it within about 30 seconds. It was really an incredibly wonderful conversation about the work, about my process with Don and Chad. I'd do it all over again. I mean, it was, not all studio visits are equal, but this was, it's right at the top of my list. It was one, they asked some really interesting questions, challenging questions, and we had some good conversation over it. So it happened very quickly, and I heard back in a fairly reasonable amount of time too, yeah. So I felt very fortunate to be included in this show. It's my honor, and I thank you all for coming. Certainly.
When you were shredding your father's junk mail, my father had Alzheimer's. Did it occur to you that maybe the shredded mail was like his mind? I mean,
of course it did, especially early on. I'm glad you asked that question, because I actually questioned the fact whether I should use it to make art, if it was too soon or if it was too personal. I didn't want to sensationalize it, but here's what's happened, and I think this is kind of a pattern that my work takes, but I know other artists work in this way too, not everyone, but I let my work go through an incubation period. It's not planned, it happens. I just allow it to happen. With the junk mail, I had no other choice, I thought, but to just let it incubate for X amount of time. And it was when I made the decision to start shredding, and those thoughts really surfaced almost immediately, you know. And so that shredded paper continued to pile up and take space and began to grow. And it became a very interesting organic being, so to speak. It started exhibiting signs of its own life because of the little shreds acted like fibers, like wool fibers and like cotton fibers, locking itself together. It became very dense. I recognized if it was just piled out quickly and there were voids in it, that it would change its own shape over time, but if I packed it together, it would maintain its shape. So what happened over this almost 3 years is that what it began as and what it evolved as continued to change. So the work has become, there's always the undercurrent of my father, of junk mail and that industry, of all of the really interesting things that surface. But what has happened is the evolution and the transitioning of the work from point A to where I am now. And I can't give you a place. I think I'm continuing with it indefinitely, just like with the rest of my work. I think that is a revelation to me, to understand it's becoming more about change every day. And that's a whole lot about a lot of us, or all of us, yeah. And so, yeah, and then the other interesting part I have to say is that my father really has left me a rather enigmatic legacy. And that's in large part because he died a year ago and the mail continues to come in. And my mother is giving it to me, and I welcome it. I don't think she does, but I certainly do. But he's left me with something. My father would have been an amazing artist and had started in architectural school long ago until he inherited a hardware store that, and things changed. But over the years, he taught us all to draw and to, we enjoyed the things that he did with us. And so I kind of feel like he's still collaborating and working on this project, although I don't really think it's about him any longer. He's just part of it. Yeah, he's part of what made it instrumental for me to do that, yeah. So.
What about the conservation issues involved in junk mail?
Definitely, yes. You can't deny that. That's all heavily acid-based materials. I knew that going into this, and I knew that, creating a wall installation the size of this and actually working on a larger one right now, I knew those were issues. But I think, in part, I was able to jump into it with both feet because I understood what was happening with the work, the idea of transition. I went back and I pulled out all kinds of magazines, newspaper clippings, old newspapers in full, and looked at how they have behaved over the last 30 or 40 years to see. I went through my mother's stuff, I went through my stuff, my sister's things, and certainly they've changed. They've changed. Some have changed more than others. In part, it'll have to do with how it's stored, but I'm open to the idea that these are going to change. I know the color is going to change. I'm actually guessing, and I think it's going to become a very golden color, but and I could be wrong. The diversity of the different kind of papers that are within this are going to have a lot to do with it. And I think it can be pretty interesting. And then there's always the side fact that I would never want to put a preservationist out of work. And so, yeah, but no, but But seriously, I mean, I really had to consider that. But I decided to jump in with both feet, and I'm going to see where it goes. You know, it may not go as I believe it will, but we will wait and see. So far, it's very forgiving, you know. So, but that's a valid question. But the rest of my work is all archival, all of this. And I use an amazing printer, so, yeah. So.
I'm still thinking about the way this is this stiffened? Is it stiffened into this form, or is it just displayed in this? I mean, did it start out flat and you molded it?
It did start out flat. I worked on a horizontal, I worked vertically and horizontally on it. I shifted it back and forth. But when I was reaching, you know, a finished state of volume and size, I worked on, you know, determining the kind of backing and the contour. When I determined the kind of backing and that was glued in place, all I did was shape and form it as I want it to be. It still remains flexible, but it can't be flattened out. It will spread apart to some degree, but for instance, when it was shipped here, it has a form that is shaped under it. And then there is, for the preparators, in order to install, there are instructions in a pattern that show how the fasteners, the distance between, in order for it to maintain that same kind of shape and curvature. But yeah, there is quite a bit of flexibility, and there is with most of my work. There's very few of them who are not, which are not. One or two are stiff, yeah.
Pattern to some degree when it went from the straight, flat design to the undulating?
It did not change the pattern. It just enhanced what, and I knew I was wanting to give it contour and to give it topography beyond the surface topography of the density, yeah. But no, it really didn't change it. I think perhaps it may have enlivened it somewhat, for lack of a better term. Yeah.
I've always been fascinated with photography and film and the moving image, and just as we've moved into the 21st century, we've just been inundated with images in the online world. And I was wondering that because you were narrowing it down and minimalizing on the selection of your images, how that sort of changes your experience with everyday life, sort of what you're retaining, your memories, because you're working in this style, like how making this artwork is changing your actual perception. Are you noticing anything, or?
Well, I think I'm not too sure yes, not yeah, yes. I think about it all the time. There are certain times I actually walk out of my studio or home and think that I must leave the camera behind, and so that I can absorb the rest of the world. And I think that's where I make the connection between everybody is a photographer now, you know, with smartphones and devices and everything, is that what I have found is that I want some distance occasionally, so that I can think about how I'm living or where I am at, where I'm going, what's happening around me. If I can't understand that, and if I can't find it or see it, then my work's not going to happen I don't think in the way that I would intend for it to. I think I would lose, you know, it's a perception on my part, but I think I would lose just some sort of a grip on life as it happens. I mean, like I said, pedestrian activity is really important to me. It's important for me to see the things that are just not exactly that don't reach the top of the news every day. And I don't mean that just literally, but I mean that, you know, I find it interesting, somebody just walking back and forth here, you know, and who's going to think much about that? You know, it's important to me. I did a project a few years ago where I photographed, I mean, it was in an area of Kansas City that's really clean. You know, the streets, the sidewalks are clean. There's downtown council workers. They wear these little colored jackets and they're sweeping all the time. I went down there and crawled around on the sidewalk for 4 months, taking images of things I found on the sidewalks throughout a 3-block area, from 9th Street to 12th Street on Central Avenue. You would be amazed what's there and what it can tell you about the people who are passing through, who's working there, who lives in condos in that area, who's just passing through. It is absolutely amazing. So those are the kind of details. I think that if I don't give myself some distance sometimes, I will miss that kind of thing. I just need some sort of a fresh approach every time I go out, even if I'm looking at the same subject matter. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
We're still looking for pattern.
I'm not looking for the pattern, but when I start working with the images, either on the piece itself or in the computer, I will see it's going to happen. But I let it happen once it gets to the surface. So yeah, I know it's going to happen inevitably. I have now figured that out. At first, years ago, it was always a revelation. Look what I did. You know? But no, I know it's going to happen. So yeah, and so it's a little bit of yeah, it's going to come out, and it has to do with the selective process. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your questions about the photography, but.
I wonder, in regarding this exhibition, have you had the opportunity to interact much with the other artists? And if so, do you feel like there's some kind of a transference there? Does their technique or philosophy impact you going forward, and vice versa?
What I have found with my interaction with other artists who are in this show is the diversity of the type of process and the type of work that is happening. And I think that probably affects me more than anything. I have such great interest and admiration for a lot of the work, the artists who are in the show, and to learn more about that, I think that's what's impacted me more than anything. So, yeah.